Okay, this is the installation instructions for the extended runtime fuel tank kit for the Yamaha EF2000iS. First step will be to remove the back cover of the generator. Actually, let me shut that fan off. I'm sure the microphone is picking up on that. Once you get the top screws out, the rest of the cover just unsnaps, and then you lift the bottom of it out. The bottom of it is held in place by these 3 cleats that slide into these holes. And then there are 2 round plugs here and here, and one here that snap into place. The first item to notice, if you look back in here, you'll see the fuel hose, and it's the one with the white dot on it. We're going to remove the end of the fuel hose that is connected to the fuel selector valve. Okay. The fuel hose is held in place by a Corbin clamp, and what you do to get it disconnected is you have to squeeze these 2 tabs together and just slide it out of the way. Normally it's right here at the end of the hose, connecting it to the hose barb. Squeeze the 2 tabs, move it back, and then grab the hose and slide it off of the barb. At this time, we're going to slide the hose out of the way. Now, you take the kit. Comes with 5 feet of hose, 1/4 inch, fuel filter, a bag of connectors, hose clamps, teflon tape, and a big glue line. We're going to take the fuel pump, put it in place right here. You'll notice that there's a small tab of steel sticking out that the inverter module mounts to. We're going to drill a 9/64 hole right here, where we're going to run a sheet metal screw into that is included in the kit, and that's where it's going to be mounted. Okay, I'm going to drill the initial pilot hole with a 1/8 drill bit, and then I'll come back and drill it out to the finished size. The kit comes with 2 screws. I'm going to use one of the screws to kind of tap this hole out. Just work the screw in and out, and it'll cut just a little bit deeper each time. screws that are included in the kit, incidentally, are identical. So you use one screw to go ahead and cut threads into the metal. Once you've done that, make sure and throw that screw away, because it will damage the end of the screw slightly, cutting the threads. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a fuel manifold. One end of it is going to go to the back of the fuel selector valve. Another end is going to go to the top of the generator, which will connect to the fuel inlet. And in the third portion of the manifold is going to go through a fuel filter and to the inlet port on the pump. So what we're going to do is take the 1/4-inch hose that's included in the kit. We'll cut a 2-inch section of it. Then an 11-inch section. You open up the bag of hardware, you'll see a 1/4-inch fuel tee. Actually, there's 2 of them. They are identical. Take one of them, I get just a little bit of oil on the end of the fuel tee. Plug that in to the 2-inch hose. Get a little bit of oil on the other stem of the fuel tee. Connect the 11-inch hose like this. Then cut a 1.5-inch section . Put it onto the fuel tee in this position. Then take the fuel filter. Notice there's an arrow on the fuel filter and it points this direction. That's the direction of fuel flow. Connect it to this bottom piece of the fuel line, so it'll look like this. Then cut a 7-inch section of the fuel hose. And I'm going to cut this just a little bit longer, because I can always trim it shorter when I'm done. At this point, I'm going to open up the bag with the hose clamps. I'm going to put hose clamps on each of the connections. now it'll look like this. Notice on the T-fitting, because the clamping portion of the hose clamps is fairly large, I face one this way and the other two up and backwards. And this is simply to create enough room. It doesn't matter if they're pointing straight up or back or whatever. You can rotate them around. It's just a whole lot easier if you don't have all three facing forward. And that's probably a good place to take a break. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put the fuel inlet fitting in the top of the generator. If you notice, right at the front of the web for the handle and out about 3/4 of an inch is where we're going to put the fuel fitting. If you stick your hand inside, you'll be able to feel some webbing inside the generator case, the plastic webbing, and it has foam over it. But you can feel where the plastic webs are, and you want to bullseye the spot right in the center of the webbing. Because of that, I'm first going to drill a 1/8 inch hole where I'm eventually going to drill a 1/2 inch hole. The reason is, when I drill the hole through, I'm pretty much going by guess as to where it's going to come through at. Once I get it drilled through, then I can feel exactly where it is, and if I get it off by 1/8 of an inch, it's not a big deal, because the hole that I'm ultimately going to be drilling is going to be a 1/2 inch diameter. That actually looks really nice. So even with the front of the webbing straight out between 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch, the further you move it this way, the easier it is to screw the fuel fitting in from the top. If you go too close to the handle, you have to hold the fuel fitting right here steady and screw the hose barb on from the bottom. Now what I'm going to use to drill the final hole is a step drill. I use these because they are convenient and I'm possibly overconfident. I don't recommend them actually, because if you drill too deep, the hole is also too big. The end size of this hole is going to be just slightly larger than a 1/2 inch. So if you've got a 1/2 inch drill bit, you're probably safe to go ahead and use that instead. If you've used step drills before and you have one, then go ahead and use it. I don't advise buying one for this job because they are a little pricey too. So right now I've got the hole drilled to a 1/2 inch. And now there's foam on the inside of this cover, very much like this foam. And what I've done is I've just picked away a section of foam right around the hole that I drilled. Now I'm going to take a burring knife. You can either use a repairman's needle or a repairman's reamer or a burring knife or whatever, just to clean up the slag, because the plastic leaves a lot of slag on it. And I just want to clean that up. Okay, this is a quick disconnect fuel fitting. It'll be going into the top of the generator. And this is a hose barb that you'll be screwing onto the bottom. You'll notice that there is a gap between the hose barb and the fuel fitting. And what you'll do is tighten this down, and it will pinch against the plastic at the same time that these threads become good and tight. The first step is to take the roll of Teflon tape that's included in the kit and put it over the threads, being very careful not to overlap the end of the threads, because if it overlaps the end of the threads, it can tear. So do not allow something like that to happen, because if it does, when you screw the hose barb off, or screw the hose barb onto it, it can tear that piece of Teflon loose, and it may end up in the wrong spot. In all likelihood, it will actually just end up getting caught in the fuel filter. But there's always a possibility that it will end up somewhere else. So I'm going to hold the hose barb and just thread this fitting into it. Now you'll see what I mean. Drill this hole far enough out from the handle that you can actually screw the fuel fitting in from the top while holding the hose barb in place from the bottom, and it makes your job a lot easier. And just check it and make sure it's not pinching down on the plastic yet as it starts to tighten up, because I want it to end with the fittings pointing forward. And the reason is, when I hook the hose, okay, it's starting to pinch now. When I hook the fuel hose to it, I want the fuel hose to come up the front and lay right between the fuel cap and the handle, and then hook on here. That way it is extremely unlikely that the fuel hose will ever go near the back of the generator, keeping in mind the back of the generator here is where the hot exhaust gases come out, and we don't really want the fuel to be anywhere near there if we can possibly avoid it. Take our fuel manifold that we built. This hose is going to go forward and hook on to the fuel selector valve. This hose is going to go backwards and hook on to the hose barb that is attached to the bottom of this. Let me raise this card up a little bit. fuel hose is going to run behind the spark plug cap. The main reason, in fact the only reason I want it behind the spark plug cap is it just makes it easier to change the spark plug in the future. Because the spark plug is a service item, and once this fuel line is installed, it's pretty much going to live there. Now if you look, this hose is installed onto the bottom of the hose barb, and this hose is installed onto the back of the fuel selector valve. At this time I'm going to take two more hose clamps, put one holding it to the hose barb, the other holding it to the fuel selector valve. And that is probably as good a place as any to go ahead and take a break. Okay, if you look up in here, you can now see that there's a hose clamp on the bottom of the hose barb. And then if you look at the manifold, you'll notice that the fuel filter is centered between the recoil start mechanism and the back of the inverter module. If you need to pull it back off and trim the 2-inch section of hose that goes from the fuel T mentioned earlier to the fuel selector valve, then go ahead and pop it off and get that fuel filter as close to dead center as possible. It's not critical that it be dead centered, but if you do choose to later on, I'm working on an electric start for this, and hopefully the electric start for the Yamaha 2000 will not become the money pit that the electric starter for the Honda did. But at any rate, you'll need the fuel filter centered between the inverter module and the recoil start to do that. And as you can see, I've also got a hose clamp on the fuel line where it goes into the back of the fuel selector valve. Okay, the next item is going to be to take the fuel pump, and we've already drilled the hole here, and the solid black side is going to be facing out, not the side with the gold vent in it. If you'll look real closely at the fuel pump, you'll see that where the side with the one hose barb that comes out, if you'll look at it really closely, there's a small arrow pointing outward, and that's fuel output. And on this one, there's a small arrow pointing inward. That's where the fuel enters the fuel pump. And this has a letter P, which is the pulse line. So this is fuel output, so we'll connect the hose that goes to the carburetor to this one. And that has the factory Yamaha Corbin clamp still on it. And go ahead and put the fuel pump and just do a test fit. Make sure that the hole where the fuel pump goes is lined up, and then look at this hose and make sure that it does not touch the choke linkage, because if you've got a rubber hose touching a metal choke linkage, it will be choke linkage 1, rubber hose 0. Okay, this is the hose that comes from the input, so it'll go to the input fitting on the fuel pump, which will be this bottom hose barb right here. And I'm going to put one of the clamps that's included in the kit in that location. I'm not going to bolt the fuel pump down yet because it's nice and handy to be able to move the fuel pump around when you're working on it. When you put this clamp on, make sure you don't have the clasping portion of the clamp facing backwards. This is a fairly good angle to have it at because when it bolts in place, you don't want it to push the pump out away from the housing of the inverter module. It should allow the pump to bolt solidly to this tab. I'm going to turn it just slightly because it's just touching. And now it's got clearance. Okay, the third hose, which is this one, is going to go to the pulse line. Unfortunately, on this generator, Yamaha has elected not to put a positive crankcase ventilation valve in, which simply makes our job easier. So what we'll do is take the breather hose loose from the intake right here. We'll mark the hose right where it starts to emerge from behind this plastic cover, and then we'll cut it here. Let's go ahead and take a break for just a moment. Okay, I've made a mark on the hose, and I was clever enough to use a black magic marker to mark a black hose with. Hopefully you can see the mark that I made. If you look, what I've done is right here is the edge of this plastic brace, and just slightly behind the edge of the plastic brace is where I've made the line on the hose. What I'm going to do is cut that hose right on the line. Be careful when you cut the hose. Do not cut the wires going to the stepper motor for the throttle. If you cut those wires, you'll be angry with yourself and possibly me, possibly everybody. So now you see that I have cut off a section of hose. Take the other fuel tee that's included in the kit, and if you've confused yourself as to which end goes where, the end that is slightly more jagged is probably the cut that you made. The factory cut is nice and smooth. Put the T fitting pointing down. You will be able to rotate it back and forth just slightly. This barb of the T fitting will go into the end of the breather hose in the stock location. I'm going to leave this exposed for right now because it is slightly easier to work with. I'm going to hook the remaining piece of hose that's included in the kit to the last barb of this T-fitting. As you see, the kits come with a lot of extra hose, so if you make a mistake and you cut one of these hoses too short, don't sweat it. Get another piece of hose and cut it to the right length. Now I'm going to take this elbow of the breather hose and put it right back onto the fitting in the intake manifold. They made everything black, which makes it hard to see. But as you can see, here's the fitting where it goes to. Then I'm going to take this hose and figure a length that'll be a nice gentle curve. So with the fuel pump bolted in place here, make a nice gentle curve on this hose. I'll cut the hose right here. This hose is a pulse hose, so it does not carry any gasoline. Incidentally, you may end up with extra hose of this length said earlier, if you made any mistakes during the assembly of the kit, go ahead and use another piece of the hose. This final hose will connect to the pulse line of the fuel pump. As I was saying before I stopped and lost my train of thought, this hose is a pulse line, which means it does not carry any liquid, gasoline or otherwise. It simply carries a pressure wave of air. So now that we got all the hoses cut to the right length, I'm going to put the screw in. It'll hold the fuel pump in place. Now, as you can see, this hose hides behind this little lip on this brace. Comes down right in front of the air box. If you wanted, you could actually trim this hose just a little bit shorter, and it would go up over the top of the air box and actually be easier to change the air filter. And now that I've just said that, I think I'm going to go ahead and switch this one. And that's the nice thing about doing this at your house, is if you make a mistake or change your mind like that, and you're not in front of a video camera, nobody knows that you made a mistake. Of course, if you videotape it and then post it on the internet, everybody gets to share a laugh at your expense. So if I trim it to right here, it'll stay above the air filter, which makes the air filter easier to change and still stays as a nice smooth arc. Once again, make sure that the hose that goes on here with the factory clamp on it does not touch the choke linkage. Because again, that choke linkage is made of metal. I'm going to take this off and shorten this hose too, because I don't like the Z-bend. If you look, the output hose on the pump is just slightly kinked here. So I'm going to shorten this hose so it doesn't run as deep over here, and it'll make it into a more smooth bend. When you're putting these kits on, go over everything like that. Being that they are rubber hoses, they have a mind of their own. If something like this does appear to you, take the time to stop and change it. Do whatever you determine is necessary to correct it. I'm going to cut about 3/4 of an inch off of this hose. Go ahead and take a break. Let me answer the phone. Okay, I like that a lot better. Number one, it's a lot farther away from the choke linkage. And number two, this is a nice smooth bend in this location here. I wound up taking about 3/4 of an inch out of this hose, so it makes the bends much smoother. You could actually take closer to an inch out of it if you wanted to. Now all we have to do is put oil in it, put the cabinetry on it, and go ahead and test run it. These little generators don't hold a whole lot of oil, so the trick is really not to have oil running out on the floor. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Just be careful as you're filling it. Perfect. You should just barely be able to see oil at the end of the threads. Coming up this tube, the oil would just come up to the end of the threads. Okay, we'll take one last look at it and then put the cabinetry back together. Again, these 3 tabs slide into the grooves in the bottom of the generator. And then the round ones get pushed into the snaps. So that the cover will pretty much hold itself on. And there are 2 screws. That go into the back cover. Now you'll notice that the kit has one other fitting. This fitting will go into your fuel tank. The kit also includes a genuine Yamaha fuel hose. They are 10 feet long with quick disconnects at either end. One will hook onto the fuel tank, the other will hook onto the generator. You'll notice that they have arrows pointing in the direction of fuel flow. So this one with the little shape of the fuel tank and an arrow in the center hooks onto the fuel tank, and this one with an arrow pointing out hooks onto the generator. You also have extra hose clamps in case you get a little aggressive or lose a clamp or something like that. There are extras in the kit. Let's go ahead and take this outside and we'll test run it.